"Grandpa," she said, "you're not family anymore." That's the sentence that ended my quiet Tuesday evening, not a phone call from a doctor, not a knock from a process server. Just my granddaughter's small voice coming through a tablet screen, propped against a stack of schoolbooks, whispering like she was afraid the walls themselves might report her. I didn't know it yet, but that whisper was the last quiet evening I'd have for a long while. Welcome back. Settle in, pour whatever you're drinking, and get comfortable, because in these stories, the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually. If you believe that too, hit subscribe before we start, because you won't want to miss what happens next. My name is Harold Whitfield. 65 years old. 38 of those years spent building a logistics and freight company from a single rented truck into something that now moves cargo across 4 states. I started that company the year my son Marcus turned 2, driving routes myself at 4 in the morning while my wife Eleanor ran the books from our kitchen table, a calculator in one hand and a baby balanced on her hip with the other. We built slow. We built honest. By the time Marcus was in high school, we had 11 trucks and a warehouse. By the time he graduated college, we had 94 trucks, 3 regional hubs, and a payroll that supported 400 families who never once had to wonder if their check would clear. I sold my controlling stake publicly 8 years ago, not long after Eleanor passed. Grief does strange things to a man's relationship with the things he built. I couldn't walk into that warehouse anymore without hearing her voice asking me if I'd eaten lunch. So I sold the majority position to a firm that promised to keep the drivers on, keep the pension intact, keep the name on the trucks. What almost nobody outside my lawyer and my accountant knows is that I quietly retained a minority holding company that still owns pieces of half a dozen smaller businesses that grew out of that original freight company, warehousing firms, a regional shipping brokerage, and one particular staffing agency that handles corporate placements for mid-sized companies across the region. I never talk about it. I still drive a 12-year-old pickup truck. I wear cardigans my late wife bought me from a department store, not a tailor. Money was never the thing I wanted people to see when they looked at me. Eleanor used to say a man who needs people to know what he's worth has already told you everything about what he isn't. My son Marcus married a woman named Danielle about 11 years ago. She was polished, confident, always dressed like she had somewhere important to be even on a Tuesday afternoon. I liked her well enough at the wedding. Sharp mind. Quick with numbers, quicker with people. Eleanor sat next to me at the reception, though, and said something I've never forgotten. She's lovely, Harold, but watch how she talks about people who can't do anything for her. I asked what she meant. Eleanor nodded toward the bar, where Danielle had spent 10 minutes charming the caterer's supervisor, laughing at his jokes, asking about his kids by name, and then walked straight past the elderly woman refilling napkins without so much as a glance. That's how you know somebody's character, Eleanor said. Not how they treat the people who matter. How they treat the people who don't seem to. I should have listened harder to my wife. I usually did. She was right about nearly everything in 40 years of marriage, and she was right about this too. Maybe that's my flaw, if I'm honest with myself, looking back on all of it now. I heard the warning. I filed it away as wisdom instead of instruction. I let a decade pass, telling myself people change, telling myself a wedding day moment isn't a character reference, telling myself the woman charming a caterer while ignoring a napkin cart couldn't possibly be the same woman raising my granddaughter. I was wrong to wait as long as I did to look closer. 3 years into the marriage, Marcus and Danielle had a daughter, Nora. Sweet from the very beginning, quiet in that watchful way some children are, the kind who seem to be studying the room before they decide it's safe to speak. I loved that little girl the way I'd loved exactly 2 other people in my life, my late wife and my son. When Eleanor passed, 6 months after Nora's 3rd birthday, it was that little girl's small hand in mine at the funeral that got me through the worst week of my life. She didn't understand death yet. She just understood that Grandpa was sad, and she sat in my lap the whole reception afterward, patting my arm every few minutes like she was checking I was still there. For the first few years after that, things seemed fine. Nora came to my place most weekends. We'd fish off the little dock behind my house, though neither of us ever caught much worth keeping. I taught her how to check the oil in my truck, how to identify which birds were fighting over the feeder, how to whistle with 2 fingers, a skill her father never quite mastered even as an adult. She asked me endless questions about my old freight trucks, treating stories about loading docks and interstate routes like they were dinosaurs from some lost era. I never once mentioned the company I still quietly held pieces of. It never seemed relevant. I was just Grandpa. That was enough for me. Then Danielle got a promotion at her company, Coastline Regional, some operations director role that came with a corner office and a title that got printed on new business cards within a week. Something in the household shifted after that. She started working longer hours, taking calls during dinner, disappearing into a home office on weekends that used to be reserved for family. Marcus, who'd always been easygoing, started following her lead, later nights, less patience, a general sense that the house was running on somebody else's schedule now, and everyone else, including his own father, was expected to adjust around it. The visit started shrinking first in small ways. A Saturday cancelled because Nora had a birthday party. A Sunday moved because of a soccer tournament. Reasonable things, on their own. Nobody could accuse a birthday party of being sinister. But small reasonable things, stacked one on top of another, eventually build something. Within a year, our weekly dock afternoons had become once a month, then once every 6 weeks. I told myself it was normal, kids get busier as they grow, families drift a little, it evens out eventually. I've since learned that's a lie people tell themselves right up until the moment it stops being possible to keep telling it. There was a Sunday dinner, maybe 8 months before everything came apart, that I think back on now as the first real crack in the wall, the first moment I should have understood something was actively being decided rather than just naturally happening. We were all at Marcus and Danielle's place, a rare full gathering. Nora, maybe 8 at the time, was setting the table, carefully placing napkins the way I'd taught her, folded into little triangles. "Can I sit next to Grandpa?" she asked, looking up at her mother. Danielle was scrolling something on her phone, barely glancing over. "Sit wherever, sweetie. We're just eating, it's not assigned seating." "I want to sit next to him because he tells the best stories," Nora said, and I remember how proud that made me feel, hearing an 8-year-old say that with such plain confidence. Danielle finally looked up, and there was something in her expression I couldn't quite name at the time, something between mild irritation and calculation. "Maybe don't get too used to Grandpa's stories being the highlight of every weekend, Nora. We're going to be doing a lot more family things, just the 3 of us this year. New job, new priorities." I remember Marcus not saying anything, just refilling his water glass, not meeting my eyes. I let it pass that evening the way I'd let a dozen smaller comments pass before it, telling myself I was reading too much into an offhand remark at a dinner table. I wish now I'd asked the follow-up question sitting right there behind my teeth. New priorities meaning what, exactly? I didn't ask it. That's on me. Some things a man carries with him afterward, wondering what might have gone differently if he'd just said the thing out loud the first time he felt it. The evening it all finally came apart started ordinary enough. A video call, the kind Marcus and I had every couple of weeks since he'd moved 40 minutes away for Danielle's job transfer the year before. Nora was supposed to join in for 5 minutes to say hi before bedtime, same as always. Marcus stepped away to grab something from the kitchen, and for a few seconds it was just her and me on the screen, her face lit blue by the tablet, propped against a pile of homework folders on her bed. "Grandpa," she said, glancing toward her bedroom door like she was checking for footsteps in the hallway. "Can I tell you something? You have to promise not to say I told you." I promised. I always keep that kind of promise to her. I've never once broken a promise to that child, and I intended to keep this one too. "Mom said you're not really family anymore." She said it to Dad on the phone. She didn't know I heard. I was doing homework in the hallway and I wasn't trying to listen, I promise. "I want you to understand something about me. I don't rattle easily. 38 years running a freight company teaches you to keep your face still when the numbers are bad and the drivers are asking questions you don't have answers to yet. But something in my chest went very cold and very still at the same time, the way water gets right before it freezes. "Sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could manage, forcing every ounce of calm I had left in me into those next few words. "Did she say why?" Nora shook her head, brow furrowed with the effort of remembering correctly. "She said something about the house. And about, I don't remember the word. Consolidating. And she said you'd never even notice because you don't pay attention anymore. That's not true, is it, Grandpa? You pay attention. You always ask me about school, and you remembered my science project was about volcanoes even though I only told you once." I told her it wasn't true, that I noticed everything about her, and I meant it with my whole chest. But my mind was already somewhere else, running through every distant excuse, every cancelled visit, every short phone call over the past 6 months, lining them up like dominoes I hadn't wanted to see falling. "Nora," I said carefully, "I need you to do something for me, and it's very important you don't get in trouble for it. Can you remember exactly what your mom said? Even the parts you didn't understand? Take your time, sweetheart. There's no rush." She thought hard, the way children do when they're trying to be helpful and scared of getting it wrong at the same time, her small fingers twisting the edge of a homework folder. She said something about Grandpa's name still being on paperwork. And Dad said something like, "He'll never even know," and Mom said, "Good, that's the point." And then she said something about it being efficient. I remember that word because we just learned it in vocabulary. Marcus came back into the frame right then, and Nora's face changed instantly, the guarded blankness of a child who's learned to hide things quickly settling over her features like a curtain dropping shut. We finished the call the way we always did, me telling her good night, her blowing a kiss at the camera, promising to show me her cartwheel next time. Nothing about it looked unusual to Marcus. But I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that screen went dark, staring at nothing, my coffee going cold in front of me, turning her words over and over like stones in my palm. He'll never even know. That's the point. Efficient. I called my attorney the next morning. Not Marcus. Not Danielle. My attorney, a sharp woman named Priya who'd handled every piece of my business restructuring for the past decade and knew exactly which entities I still held quiet stakes in, going all the way back to the sale 8 years earlier. "Harold," she said once I'd explained what little I had, her voice careful in the way lawyers get when a client sounds shaken, "before we speculate, let's just check the obvious thing first. Does Danielle still work at Coastline Regional?" "Far as I know. She got promoted about a year ago, some director role. Give me a couple hours. I want to check something specific before I say anything else." She called back closer to 2 hours later, and I could hear something different in her voice the moment she said my name, the careful tone of someone who's found exactly what they suspected they might, and isn't looking forward to saying it out loud. "Harold, do you remember Wren Staffing Solutions? The placement agency that handles corporate hiring for a dozen companies in the region, including 2 of your old freight subsidiaries?" I remember the name. I haven't looked at that side of the portfolio in years, honestly. My accountant sends me a summary once a year and I skim it and sign what needs signing. You own 41% of it. Silent partner, no operational involvement, exactly the way you structured it when we set that entity up. I remember now. What's this got to do with Danielle? Danielle's company, Coastline Regional, uses Wren Staffing for executive placements. And about 3 weeks ago, Wren Staffing processed paperwork for Danielle's upcoming transfer into a senior director-level role that comes with an equity compensation package. Harold, part of that equity package, per the paperwork I'm looking at right now, gets funded through a profit-sharing arrangement tied directly to Wren's ownership structure. Your ownership structure. I sat with that for a moment, the phone pressed hard against my ear. So she's about to start collecting compensation that flows, even indirectly, through a company I hold a stake in. That's the surface of it, Priya said, and I could hear papers shuffling on her end. Here's the part that's going to matter more. Once I saw your name attached anywhere in that chain, I wanted to know why nobody had looped you in on a compensation structure tied to your own asset. That's standard courtesy, even if it isn't legally required for a silent minority stake. So I pulled the associated correspondence. There's an email thread between Danielle and a colleague at Coastline, a woman named Renata in their compensation department, dated about 6 weeks back. I'm going to read you a piece of it, and I want you to stay calm, Harold, because you're going to need to be very calm for what comes after this. Read it. Quote, his name's still attached to Ren on paper, but he's basically a ghost shareholder at this point. Marcus says his father barely tracks any of it anymore, doesn't even review statements half the time, hasn't been involved operationally since the sale. Once the transfer finalizes, I'll be pulling comp partially through Ren's profit share, which technically means I'd be drawing income tied to his own stake without him ever knowing or asking questions. It's not illegal, it's just efficient. He'll never even notice, and honestly, at this point, he's not really part of this family's financial picture anymore anyway. Marcus barely even brings him up. End quote. I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, not since the early days of the business when a supplier tried to shortchange an entire shipment and I found out 3 weeks too late, standing in a warehouse doing math that didn't add up and slowly understanding I'd been robbed by a man who'd shaken my hand a dozen times. Pure, cold, focused anger. Not the kind that makes a man shout. The kind that makes a man start writing things down. Priya, I said, I need everything. Every document, every email, every filing connected to Ren, Coastline, and Danielle's compensation package, and I need it organized in a way that would make sense to a judge if it ever needed to. You think this needs a judge? I don't know yet. But my granddaughter told me last night that her mother said I'm not really family anymore, in the same conversation where they were discussing how to quietly draw income off an asset that's mine without telling me. I intend to find out exactly what that means before I decide what happens next. Give me a week, Priya said, her voice gentler now. Document first. Whatever you're feeling right now, sit with it, but don't act on it until we know the whole shape of this. I've seen men move too fast on half a picture and lose leverage they didn't need to lose. I agreed, though every instinct in me wanted to drive to Marcus's house that same night, spreadsheet or no spreadsheet, and ask him to his face what kind of man lets his wife talk about his own father that way in front of his daughter. I've learned over 65 years that the men who win are rarely the ones who move fastest. They're the ones who move once, correctly, with everything already in place. Eleanor used to tell me that too, back in the early days of the business, when I wanted to fire a driver on the spot over a suspicion instead of waiting for proof. Measure twice, Harold. You only get to cut once. That week felt longer than most years of my life. I kept our regular schedule, kept my Sunday calls with Nora, kept my voice steady every single time, even the evening she mentioned, almost in passing, while showing me a drawing she'd made, that her mother had said something about restructuring the family a little bit once the new job started. I asked her, as gently as I could, what that meant. She shrugged the way kids do when they've heard something they don't fully understand but know it matters. I think it means Dad's not going to have as much time. Mom said priorities are shifting. She said it a lot this week, actually. Priorities shifting. Priorities are shifting. I wrote that phrase down the second the call ended, underneath the other one. Efficient. Consolidating. Priya's investigation, when it landed a week later, was more thorough and more damning than I'd braced for, even with everything I'd already suspected. It turned out this wasn't simply Danielle quietly benefiting from an asset connected to my name. There was a second layer, one that changed the entire shape of what I was looking at. A financial planner Danielle had consulted 8 months earlier, a man named Curtis Boyle who ran a boutique wealth advisory firm 2 towns over, had drafted a broader strategy document for her and Marcus jointly. Priya obtained a version of it through a records request tied to an entirely separate compliance review that Boyle's firm happened to be under at the time, unrelated to us, pure coincidence of timing that worked in our favor. Buried in an appendix of that strategy document, under a section titled Family Asset Positioning, was language that I'm going to read to you exactly the way it was written, because paraphrasing it wouldn't do justice to how deliberately cold it was. Quote, "Given Harold Whitfield's advanced age and reduced day-to-day engagement with his remaining business holdings, we recommend a strategy of maintaining minimal but cordial visibility with the elder Whitfield. This approach preserves eventual inheritance access and estate positioning while limiting current relational obligations, holiday-related financial expectations, and time commitments that could otherwise strain the primary household schedule. We further recommend that communications regarding shared assets, particularly the Wren staffing profit share arrangement, proceed without proactive disclosure to Mr. Whitfield, as his historical pattern of minimal portfolio review suggests low probability of discovery within the relevant planning window." End quote. I read that sentence probably a dozen times before I let myself believe it said what it said. They weren't just quietly profiting off an asset connected to me. There was an actual documented plan, drafted by a paid professional, laying out exactly how much relationship to maintain with me, and how little, calibrated down to holiday visits and phone calls, all of it calculated against how long they figured I might live and how much of what I'd built might eventually come their way if the relationship, thin as it was, stayed technically intact. Minimal but cordial visibility. That phrase sat in my chest for days afterward like a stone I couldn't swallow or spit out. I called Marcus that night. Not to accuse him outright. I needed to hear his voice first, needed to know if my son had actually known about this document, or if this was entirely Danielle's doing, something done to him as much as to me. "Dad," he said when he picked up, and something in his voice told me before he said another word that I already had my answer. "Hey, what's going on, is everything okay?" "Marcus. Have you ever heard of a document called Family Asset Positioning?" Silence on the line. Long enough that I could hear him breathing, long enough that I knew. "Dad, look, that's financial planning language, advisors write things like that about everyone, it doesn't mean." "Did you read it, Marcus? Did you sit across from Curtis Boyle and read a paragraph that described your own father as somebody whose relational obligations should be limited to preserve inheritance access?" "It's not, Dad, you're taking it out of context, that standard estate planning terminology. They write reports like that for every client. Your daughter told me you're barely part of this family's financial picture anymore." That's a direct quote from an email your wife wrote about me to a coworker. Your daughter told me herself, unprompted, whispering it like a secret, that her mother said I'm not really family anymore. You want to explain to me how a 9-year-old ends up carrying that sentence around in her chest, Marcus? Because I promise you, she didn't invent it. He didn't have an answer. I gave him a long moment to find one anyway, because some part of me, the same part that used to see the boy who cried when his dog died, who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on long drives home from his grandmother's house, wanted him to surprise me. Wanted him to say something that made this make sense, that gave me a version of my son I could still recognize. He didn't. "Dad, you're overreacting to language you don't fully understand." "I understand it fine, son. I ran a company for 38 years. I've read 100 contracts written specifically to sound harmless to somebody who doesn't know what they're looking at. This wasn't harmless. This was a plan. That's not fair." "Fair," I said, and I could feel my own voice going somewhere flat and quiet, a place it hadn't gone in years, would have been telling me the truth 11 years ago about who I was watching you marry. I hung up before he could answer that one. I sat in my kitchen a long while afterward, the same kitchen where Eleanor used to sit across from me most evenings, going over the day's numbers, and I thought about what she'd said all those years ago at the wedding reception. Watch how she treats the people who can't do anything for her. I'd spent 11 years assuming that warning had expired somewhere along the way, that time and grandchildren and Sunday dinners had proven her wrong. I understood now that I'd simply been the person who could do something for Danielle the whole time, and she'd simply been patient about collecting. Nobody had ever told Danielle that quiet doesn't mean unaware. Nobody had ever told her that a man who builds a company from a single truck learns, somewhere along the way, exactly how to read a balance sheet, exactly how to spot when somebody thinks they're being clever with numbers that aren't fully theirs. I'd spent decades letting people underestimate the man in the cardigan driving the old truck. Most of the time it never mattered. This time it had cost my granddaughter a whispered secret she shouldn't have had to carry. I gave myself one more week before I acted, the same discipline that had built my company in the first place. Measure twice. I had Priya draft two things simultaneously, working with a second attorney on her team who specialized in family law, because I wanted both fronts handled by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The first was a formal notification, entirely within my legal right as a majority-adjacent stakeholder in REN staffing, restructuring the profit-sharing arrangement between REN and Coastline Regional, effective immediately, in a way that unwound the exact compensation pathway Danielle had been counting on for her new role. Nothing illegal on my end. Nothing even unusual, according to Priya. Simply an owner exercising rights he'd always held and simply never bothered to use before, because he'd never had a reason to look closely. 65 years old, and I was about to remind a much younger woman that quiet ownership is still ownership. The second was quieter, and mattered more to me. I had Priya arrange, through the family court system, a formal grandparent visitation filing, supported by documentation, that would establish protected, unremovable time with Nora regardless of whatever restructuring Danielle had planned for the family going forward. I wasn't interested in punishing my son out of spite, and I told Priya that clearly, more than once. I was interested in making certain nobody could ever again treat my granddaughter's time with me as a line item to be trimmed for convenience, calibrated against a planning window like I was a subscription somebody was deciding whether to renew. If any of you have ever felt like the family member people quietly plan around instead of plan with, I want you to know something before we go further. Being underestimated isn't the same as being wrong about who you are. Stay with me, because it gets harder before it gets better. The day the compensation restructuring took effect, Danielle called me directly for the first time in well over a year. Her voice had none of the polish I remembered from the wedding reception, none of the bright managed tone she used at family dinners. "Harold, there's been some kind of error with the rent staffing profit share, it's affecting my entire compensation package for the new role, this is a serious problem for my career timeline, I need you to look into it immediately." "There's no error," I said, calm as still water, calmer than I'd felt in weeks, honestly, now that the waiting was finally over. "I'm simply choosing, for the first time in years, to actually pay attention to an asset that's mine." Silence on the other end, long enough that I could hear her breathing change, could hear something shift in the quality of that silence from confusion to dawning understanding. "You went through my emails," she said finally, quieter now, all the polish gone. "I went through documentation that concerned an asset I own," I corrected her. "Documentation that happened to include your own written words describing me as a ghost shareholder who'd never notice." "No," she admitted, "it never does. But look at what you're holding. A documented strategy explicitly describing a plan to limit a grandparent relationship for financial preservation. A profit-sharing arrangement drawn without disclosure to the actual owner. No judge in this state looks at that folder and sides with the people who wrote it." Danielle's attorney tried anyway, of course, stood up and talked for a long while about family privacy, about the emotional toll of litigation on a young child, about how financial planning documents often contain language that sounds worse out of context than it actually is in practice. The judge, a tired-looking woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, let him finish entirely, didn't interrupt once, and then asked one question that ended the whole argument in about 4 seconds. "Counsel," she said, "does your client dispute that this document exists, or that the language I've been quoted was actually written by the advisory firm your client retained and paid for?" He didn't have an answer that made things any better. He sat back down. Afterward, out in the parking lot, standing beside my old truck under a gray sky that felt like it might finally decide to rain, I called Priya to thank her properly, and then I sat in the driver's seat for a long while before I turned the key, just breathing, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight for almost 2 months straight. I called Prince that evening. My late brother's son, my nephew, works in corporate security now, a career he built after years in the Navy, and he's the one person outside Priya I'd told the whole story to as it unfolded, mostly because he's the only person in the family who's never once needed convincing that quiet men can still be paying very close attention. It's done, I told him. Protected visitation, court ordered. Nobody gets to quietly trim that away for convenience anymore. Uncle Harold, he said, and I could hear him grinning through the phone, I still can't believe you sat on that restructuring paperwork for a week without saying a word to anybody before you moved. Measure twice, I said. Your father used to say the same thing to me back when we were young and stupid and I wanted to fire a man on a hunch. Dad would have been proud watching you do this by the book instead of just showing up and yelling, though I know some part of you wanted to just show up and yell. Some part of me still does, I admitted. Every single day since that video call. But you didn't. No, I said. I didn't. Some jobs you do quiet, and you do them right, and you let the paperwork do the yelling for you. Marcus tried calling a handful of times over the following months. I answered most of them, because he's still my son and some doors don't close all the way even when every reasonable part of you thinks they should. But something had shifted permanently in how I heard his voice on those calls. I kept waiting for the moment he'd say the thing I needed to hear, some acknowledgement that he'd let his own daughter grow up believing her grandfather might not really be family, rather than correcting it the instant he first heard about it, rather than tearing up a strategy document the moment Curtis Boyle handed it across a desk. That exact moment never fully came, not the way I'd hoped for it. What came instead, about 4 months later, over coffee at a diner neither of us had been to before, was a quieter conversation, one where he admitted, staring mostly at his hands rather than at me, that part of him had gone along with Danielle's plan because it was simpler than pushing back, because keeping the peace at home had felt, in each individual moment, more urgent than defending an old man who'd never once asked for anything from either of them, who'd never once made his presence in their lives feel like an obligation. I understand that, I told him, and I meant it, more than he probably expected me to. I understand choosing what's easy in the moment. I spent 38 years running crews, and I watched plenty of good men make that exact mistake under pressure, choosing the quiet path over the right one because the quiet path doesn't ask anything of you today. But son, I need you to understand something too. Easy in the moment and right are not always the same thing, and a child pays the difference eventually, whether we mean for her to or not. Nora paid for it. She's the one who had to whisper a secret she shouldn't have had to carry, sitting alone in her room checking the hallway for footsteps. He didn't have an answer for that either. I didn't need him to. Some conversations aren't really about getting the other person to agree completely, right there in the moment. They're about making sure the truth got said out loud at least once, clearly, without softening, so nobody could later pretend it hadn't been said, or hadn't been heard. Danielle and Marcus separated about 8 months after the hearing, for reasons that I understand were mostly unrelated to me directly, though I imagine the strain of everything that surfaced didn't help whatever cracks were already sitting underneath that marriage. I didn't take any satisfaction in that when I heard about it, and I want to be honest about that with you, because I know some of you watching might expect me to. I didn't build anything I did out of a desire to punish anyone into loneliness. I built it to protect one little girl's right to a grandfather who showed up, unconditionally, for as long as I have left to show up. Nora is 11 now. She spends every other weekend at my place, protected time nobody gets to quietly trim away for convenience anymore, written into an order with a judge's signature on it. She still comes down to the dock with me, though she's gotten considerably better at fishing than I ever was at her age, which I remind her of constantly, mostly because it makes her laugh every single time. If you've made it this far with me, I want you to do something for me right now, in the middle of the story, before we get to the end. If any part of this reminds you of somebody in your own life who showed up quietly, without asking for credit, hit that like button for them right now, wherever they are. She asked me once, maybe 6 months after everything settled into its new shape, why her parents had said what they said that year, sitting cross-legged on my dock with her sneakers off, dangling her feet just above the water. I told her the truth, because she's earned nothing less from me for the rest of my life, and I've promised myself I never soften the truth for her just because it's easier in the moment, the exact mistake I watched her father make. I told her that some grown-ups get so focused on what somebody might be worth someday that they forget to notice what that person is worth right now, today, sitting across the dock from them with a fishing rod and too much sunscreen on their nose. I told her that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with choices the adults around her had made, choices that were never hers to carry. "Did it make you sad?" she asked, watching a dragonfly land on the end of her rod. "For a while," I admitted. "But then I remembered something your grandmother used to say, back before you were born. Watch how people treat you when they think you're not paying attention. That's how you know who they really are." "Were you paying attention, Grandpa? The whole time?" I smiled at that, reaching over to fix the collar on her jacket, which had flipped up wrong the way it always did. "I'm always paying attention, sweetheart. I just don't make a show of it. Never saw the point in making a show of things." Last month, at her school's father-daughter dance, since Marcus had a work conflict that, if I'm honest, I don't fully believe he tried very hard to move, I put on the one good blazer I own, the one I bought for Eleanor's memorial service and hadn't worn since, and I walked into that gymnasium with my granddaughter on my arm, both of us grinning like a couple of fools under cheap streamers somebody's committee had definitely overpaid for. She spun me around the floor to some song neither of us knew the words to, both of us laughing too hard to actually dance properly, and I thought about a video call almost a year earlier and a whispered sentence that had once nearly broken something in me. None of that touched this gymnasium. None of it touched her laughter echoing off a disco ball and a folding table covered in punch and cookies. That's the whole job, in the end. Not making the people who underestimated you sorry, though I won't pretend that didn't feel something close to justice when it finally landed in that courtroom. The real job was making sure a little girl who once whispered a secret she wasn't supposed to share, checking the hallway for footsteps, would never again wonder whether somebody considered her worth showing up for. I didn't know it that first evening, staring at a blue-lit tablet screen and a granddaughter's careful whisper, that I was about to spend the better part of a year quietly correcting a mistake 3 decades of built discipline had taught me exactly how to unwind, one document at a time, one measured decision at a time. I'd do it again tomorrow. I'd do it 100 times over, every single time, without hesitation. Quiet was never weakness. It was just patience, waiting for the moment truth needed saying out loud, and then saying it clearly enough that nobody could ever pretend they hadn't heard it. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit that subscribe button before you go, tell me down in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I love reading through this community checking in from all over the world every single night, and I will see you in the next one.